The papers in my hand feel like a death sentence. Not for her, but for me. A process server just shoved legal documents at me, screaming about a lawsuit I never saw coming. I shove past him, lungs burning as I sprint up the stairwell, clutching the donor forms that were supposed to save my mother's life. But when the doctor looks at the blood test, his face goes pale. The results are impossible. The woman I've spent my life trying to please isn't even my mother. And now, I have no idea who I am. The fluorescent lights hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled against Sarah Miller's molars. The air in the Ohio State University Medical Center smelled of scorched coffee and industrial bleach, a scent that clung to the back of her throat. She gripped the plastic ballpoint pen, its barrel slick with her palm's moisture. Across the laminated desk, the legal coordinator tapped a rhythmic cadence on a stack of folders. Sarah's eyes snagged on the fine print of the organ donor forms. The words blurred into jagged black lines. Clause 4.2, irrevocable consent. To her left, Eleanor's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound echoing through the thin curtain separating the intake station from the waiting bay. It was the sound of a clock running out of batteries. Sarah felt the weight of the daily debt notebook tucked into her back pocket, the leather cover pressing against her spine. She had calculated the cost of this hospital stay down to the cent, adding it to the thousands she already owed for the simple crime of existing. The coordinator pushed a bowl of peppermint candies toward her, but Sarah didn't take one. She couldn't afford the sugar, not when every calorie felt like an advance on a loan she could never repay. She looked at the signature line. This was the ultimate payment, a kidney for a life. If she gave this, perhaps the ledger would finally hit zero. Perhaps Eleanor would look at her with something other than the cold, practiced disappointment that had defined Sarah's 30 years of life. She pressed the nib into the paper, the ink bleeding into the fibers like a dark, permanent stain. "The date goes in the top right, honey," the coordinator said, her voice dropping into a practiced, honeyed register. Sarah ignored the sweetness. The paper felt heavy, thick as parchment under her fingertips. She traced the line where her signature would bridge the gap between her sister's survival, no, her mother's survival, and her own physical hollow. Her thumb brushed the edge of the page, a small paper cut blooming a bead of crimson against the white bond. Eleanor coughed again, a sharp, productive sound that tore through the sterile silence. Sarah's hand trembled, but the pen moved, carving her name into the document. She was committed now. The debt was being called in, and she was paying in flesh. As Sarah stood to return the forms, the double doors at the end of the hallway swung open with a violent hiss of pneumatic air. A man in a wrinkled brown suit jacket and a salt and pepper beard marched toward her. He looked harried, his nose twitching like a rabbit's, and he clutched a thick manila envelope as if it were a weapon. He didn't look at the nurses or the patients. He looked only at the room numbers. "Eleanor Miller," the man barked, his voice echoing off the linoleum. Sarah stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. "She's in the ICU. I'm her daughter. Is there a problem?" The man didn't answer. He lunged forward, thrusting the envelope toward her chest. "You're Sarah Miller, resident of 422 Oak Street?" "Yes, but—" "You've been served," he snapped. He didn't wait for her to take it. He let the envelope drop, and it slapped against the floor with a heavy, wet thud. Sarah stared at the package. The return address was a law firm she didn't recognize. "What is this? My mother is dying in that room." The man was already turning away, his movements jerky. "Not my circus, lady. I just deliver the news." He began to walk away, But then he stopped, looking at the hallway layout with a sudden, panicked intensity. He didn't turn left toward the exit. Instead, he began a series of sharp right turns, circling a cleaning cart and heading back toward the vending machines. Sarah watched him, bewildered. He seemed trapped in a loop of his own making, refusing to cross the death side of the hallway. The confusion sharpened into a spike of adrenaline. If this was a lawsuit against Eleanor, it could freeze her medical power of attorney. It could stop the surgery. Sarah reached down to grab the envelope, but the process server, David Clark, suddenly doubled back. He seemed to realize he dropped the papers in a contaminated zone near the janitor's yellow sign. "Don't touch those," he yelled, his voice cracking. Sarah didn't listen. She lunged for the papers, but David's hand clamped onto her wrist. His skin was cold and smelled of stale fries. "I need a signature for the delivery confirmation." "Let go of me." Sarah shoved him. It wasn't a hard push, but it was enough to send the twitchy man stumbling back into a tray of medical instruments. The crash of stainless steel sounded like a car wreck in the quiet hall. Sarah didn't stay to apologize. She grabbed the envelope and bolted toward the stairwell, her sneakers squeaking on the waxed floor. She could hear David shouting behind her, something about 3 rights making a left. But she didn't look back. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her lungs burning with the smell of bleach and fear. She reached the 3rd floor, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She needed to find Dr. Henderson. He was the only one who could tell her if this legal mess would interfere with the transplant. She found his office at the end of a long, quiet corridor where the carpet swallowed the sound of her footsteps. The door was heavy mahogany, a stark contrast to the plastic and glass of the rest of the hospital. Sarah didn't knock. She burst inside, the manila envelope clutched to her chest. Dr. Robert Henderson was sitting behind a desk that looked large enough to serve as an altar. He didn't look up immediately. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, his lips moving in a silent, rhythmic count. 22, 23, 24, he whispered. He finally lowered his gaze, his eyes clinical and cold. "Ms. Miller, you're early, and you're bleeding." Sarah looked down at her arm. In the scuffle with the process server, she must have caught her forearm on the edge of the metal tray. A thin line of red was soaking into her sleeve. "It's nothing. Doctor, I have the forms. And a man just tried to serve us with, I don't even know what. Does this change anything? Can we still do the surgery tomorrow?" Henderson didn't reach for the forms. He didn't even offer her a bandage. He simply leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking like a dry bone. "The legalities are the least of your concerns, Sarah." He pulled a single sheet of paper from a folder on his desk. Sarah recognized the logo of the hospital's genetic lab. Her stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. "I've spent the last hour reviewing the blood panel and the secondary DNA markers," Henderson said, his voice a flat drone. "I've counted the sequences 3 times. They don't change." "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked. The room felt suddenly tilted, as if the floor were sloping toward the window. "The markers are a total mismatch, Sarah. Not just a partial one. There is no shared genetic material between you and Eleanor Miller. It is biologically impossible for her to be your mother." The words didn't make sense. They were like a foreign language Sarah had never studied. "No, I was born at St. Jude's. She told me about the labor. She told me I broke her ribs when I came out. She has the scars. Whatever scars she has, they didn't come from you," Henderson said. He looked back up at the ceiling. 1, 2, 3. "The data is absolute. You are not her donor because you are not her daughter. You're a stranger to her, Sarah. Genetically speaking, you're just a ghost in her house. Sarah felt the daily debt notebook in her pocket. The thousands of dollars, the years of apology, the weight of a life she thought she owed to the woman in the ICU. If she wasn't Eleanor's daughter, then who was she? And more importantly, what had she been paying for all these years? The drive back to the Victorian house on Oak Street was a blur of gray, rainy asphalt and the rhythmic thud of windshield wipers. Eleanor had been stabilized, the kidney failure miraculously transitioning into a state where she could be monitored at home. The hospital had released her into Sarah's care with a mountain of prescriptions and a stern warning about stress. The house loomed out of the fog like a hunched shoulder. It was a sprawling, dark-timbered thing with windows that looked like sagging eyes. As Sarah helped Eleanor through the front door, the air inside hit her, a localized, permanent chill that smelled of lavender and something metallic, like old coins. "Careful, Sarah," Eleanor hissed, her grip on Sarah's wrist like a bird's talon. "You're being clumsy. Do you have any idea what this stress is doing to my heart? After all I've sacrificed to keep you under this roof?" Sarah felt the sting of the words, but for the first time, they were met with a hard, cold knot of suspicion. She led Eleanor to the velvet sofa in the parlor. "The doctor said the blood tests were strange, Eleanor. He said we aren't a match." Eleanor's face didn't twitch. She simply closed her eyes and leaned back, her silver hair shimmering in the dim light. Doctors, they always want to complicate things with their little charts and numbers. They don't understand the bond of a mother's soul. He said it was impossible. Sarah pressed, her voice trembling. He said there's no genetic link. How is that possible if you gave birth to me? Suddenly, Eleanor's hand flew to her chest. Her breath became a series of sharp, theatrical gasps. "My heart." "Sarah, the medicine, in the kitchen." Oh God, the pain. It was the old routine. The heart spell. Usually, Sarah would fly into a panic, weeping and apologizing, begging for forgiveness as she fumbled with pill bottles. But today, Sarah stood still. She watched the way Eleanor's eyelids fluttered, just a bit too much, like a bad actress in a silent film. "The medicine is right there, Eleanor," Sarah said, pointing to the vial on the coffee table. Eleanor's gasps intensified. "I can't reach. You're so cruel. After everything. The debt. The cost of you." "Stop talking about the debt," Sarah shouted. The sound echoed up the grand staircase, rattling the glass in the chandeliers. Eleanor immediately went limp, her head lolling to the side. It was a stalemate of manipulation. Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion so heavy it felt like lead in her veins. She turned away, walking toward the hall to catch her breath. She needed to think. She needed to look at that manila envelope she'd hidden in the foyer. But when she reached for the front door handle, it wouldn't turn. She frowned, jiggling the brass knob. It was locked from the outside. She moved to the side window, pulling back the heavy velvet drapes. The heavy iron bolt on the storm door had been thrown. "Eleanor?" Sarah called out, her voice rising. There was no answer from the parlor. Sarah ran to the back door, the one leading to the garden. Locked. The windows in the dining room? Nailed shut. A cold prickle of sweat broke out across her forehead. She wasn't just home. She was in a cage. She turned back toward the stairs, thinking she could climb out a second-story window. But a sound stopped her. Thud. It came from above. Not the second floor, but the attic. A heavy, rhythmic vibration that made the floorboards beneath her feet shudder. It sounded like someone was moving furniture, or perhaps like a giant heart beating against the wood. Sarah looked up. The ceiling of the hallway was obscured by shadows. And there, standing at the top of the stairs, was a silhouette that didn't belong. It was too large, too broad to be Eleanor. "Who's there?" Sarah's voice was a whisper. The figure stepped into the sliver of light from the hallway lamp. It was a man, a mountain of a person with a scarred eyebrow and eyes that looked like dull marbles. He was wearing a white medical tunic that was 2 sizes too small, the fabric straining against his biceps. He was holding a clipboard, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at Sarah. "I'm Miller," the man said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "The aide. Your mother hired me to help with the recovery." "I didn't hear you come in," Sarah said, backing away toward the kitchen. "I've been here," Miller said. He began to descend the stairs, his movements slow and deliberate. "I've been in the attic getting things ready. You shouldn't be wandering around, Sarah. It's not safe for a girl with your condition." "I don't have a condition," Sarah snapped, though her heart was trying to kick its way out of her chest. "Eleanor says you do," Miller said. He reached the bottom of the stairs and blocked the path to the parlor. He took out a small container of yogurt and began to eat it with a tiny plastic spoon. He ate all the white parts first, meticulously scraping the sides of the cup, ignoring the fruit at the bottom. The sight was bizarre, a flash of obsessive order in a man who looked like he broke bones for a living. "I need to leave," Sarah said. "Move out of the way." Miller didn't move. He just stared at her, his jaw working as he swallowed. "Can't do that. Mother's orders. You're staying put until the paperwork is settled." Sarah realized then that Miller wasn't an aide. He was a warden. And this house wasn't a home. It was a crime scene that had been running for 30 years. Sarah's mind raced, calculating the distance between her and the heavy brass floor lamp standing near the coat rack. She needed to get to the attic. If Miller had been up there getting things ready, that's where the secrets were. That's where the noise had come from. "I forgot my mother's heart pills in the upstairs bathroom," Sarah lied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I need to go up." Miller paused, his spoon hovering near his mouth. He looked at the stairs, then back at Sarah. "I'll get 'em." "No, they're in a specific cabinet. You won't find them." Sarah took a step forward. Miller's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her upper arm. The grip was bone-crushing. "I said, I'll get 'em. You stay in the kitchen. Go count your little notebook. That's what you're good at, right?" The mention of the notebook sent a jolt of pure, white-hot rage through Sarah. This man, this stranger, was mocking the only thing she had used to survive Eleanor's tyranny. She didn't think. She swung her free arm, her fingers catching the heavy brass base of the floor lamp. With a grunt of effort, she heaved it upward. The lamp struck Miller across the temple with a dull, metallic clack. He didn't go down, but he stumbled, his grip on her arm loosening just enough. Sarah tore herself away, her skin screaming where he'd held her. She didn't head for the kitchen. She lunged for the stairs. "You little bitch!" Miller roared, his voice shaking the walls. Sarah scrambled up the steps, her hands clawing at the carpet. She could hear him behind her, his heavy boots thudding like a drum beat. She reached the second-floor landing and didn't stop, pushing through the small, hidden door that led to the attic stairs. These steps were narrow and steep, smelling of dust and ancient, rotting paper. She reached the top and slammed the door shut, throwing the small iron hook into its eyelet, just as Miller's weight hit the other side. The wood groaned, but the hook held. Open the door, Sarah, Miller screamed, pounding on the wood. It's only going to be worse if I have to break it down. Sarah ignored him. She turned to the attic. It was a cavernous space, lit only by a single flickering bulb and the gray light of the moon through a cracked window. Dust motes danced in the air like tiny ghosts. In the center of the room sat a child's rocking horse, its wooden runners worn smooth, swaying slightly as if someone had just stepped off it. Sarah's eyes scanned the floor. Near a stack of old trunks, she saw a floorboard that didn't sit flush with the others. It was scarred, the wood splintered as if it had been pried up many times. She knelt, her fingers digging into the gap. She pulled. The wood gave way with a screeching protest. Underneath, nestled in a bed of old insulation, was a small, leather-bound folder. With trembling hands, Sarah opened it. The first thing she saw was a seal, the State of Ohio, Department of Health. It was a death certificate. Name of deceased, Mary Johnson. Date of death, August 14th, 1994. Cause of death, blunt force trauma secondary to motor vehicle accident. Sarah's breath hitched. She flipped the page. Tucked behind the certificate was a Polaroid photo. It showed a woman with a wide, soft smile, wearing mismatched socks, one red, one blue. She was holding a baby with a small, crescent-shaped birthmark on its left temple. Sarah reached up, her fingers tracing the exact same mark on her own skin. Mary Johnson, Sarah whispered. The name felt like a prayer. You were my mother. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Eleanor hadn't just lied about the kidney. She hadn't just lied about the labor. She had stolen a child from a wreckage. She had taken a tragedy and turned it into a 30-year hostage situation. Beneath the death certificate, Sarah found a small, tattered book. It was a diary, the ink faded but legible. She flipped to the last entry, dated the day of the accident. The blue car has been following us again. I told the librarian, but she thinks I'm just being superstitious because of the socks. I'm not crazy. Someone wants my baby. If something happens, I've hidden the emergency cash in the... The entry ended in a jagged streak of ink. Sarah felt a tear track through the dust on her cheek. Her real mother hadn't abandoned her. She hadn't been an expensive mistake. She had been loved by a woman who wore lucky socks and feared the shadows. A heavy crash sounded from the door. The iron hook flew off the wall, and the door to the attic swung open. Miller stood there, his face contorted in a mask of sweat and fury. "Give it to me," he wheezed, stepping into the room. "The book. Give it here, and maybe I won't have to hurt you too bad." Sarah backed away, clutching the diary to her chest. She killed her, didn't she? Eleanor followed them. She caused the accident. Miller didn't answer. He just kept coming, his large hands twitching. "How much is she paying you, Miller?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. "Whatever it is, it's not enough to cover a kidnapping charge. Or murder." "I don't care about the money," Miller said. And for a second, Sarah saw the broken child behind the monster. The boy who had to eat his food in color order just to feel like the world wasn't falling apart. "I care about the order. And you're messing up the order." He lunged. Sarah dodged behind the rocking horse, the wooden toy splintering as Miller's weight crashed into it. She scrambled toward the laundry chute in the corner, a small wooden door flush with the wall. "You can't run, Sarah." Eleanor's voice drifted up from the floor below, amplified by the vents. "The police are already on their way. I told them you've had a breakdown. I told them you attacked your poor, sick mother and her nurse." Who are they going to believe? A dying woman? Or a girl who keeps a ledger of every penny she's ever spent? Sarah froze. The daily debt notebook. In the eyes of a stranger, it wasn't a record of abuse. It was evidence of a fractured mind. Eleanor had spent 30 years building a case against Sarah's sanity, just in case this day ever came. Subverted beat 3.2. Sarah backed against the attic window, the diary of Mary Johnson pressed so hard against her chest, she could feel the edges digging into her ribs. She needed a way out, a way to fight back that Eleanor couldn't manipulate. Her phone. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She needed to call a lawyer, or better yet, transfer the small savings she'd managed to hide in her own account to a private investigator. She had $3,000. The Freedom Fund she'd been adding to for 5 years, $5 at a time, hidden from the daily debt. She opened her banking app. This was the smart move. With that money, she could get a hotel, hire a car, and disappear long enough to find the detective who had handled the Johnson crash. She tapped the transfer button, her fingers flying across the screen with the competence of a woman who managed multi-million-dollar corporate budgets. She felt a surge of hope. This was the one thing Eleanor didn't control. This was the secret key to her cage. The app loaded. A green check mark appeared next to her balance. Available, $3,104.22. Sarah let out a jagged breath of relief. She began to type in the routing number for an offshore digital wallet she'd set up months ago. Just a few more seconds, she thought. Just one tap and I have air. I have a future. The screen flickered. A red banner appeared at the top of the app. Account restricted. Contact system administrator. Sarah's heart skipped. She refreshed the page. The balance didn't change, but a new notification popped up. Legal hold placed by co-signer. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Eleanor. Years ago, when Sarah had opened the account, Eleanor had insisted on being a contingent beneficiary for safety. Sarah had checked the fine print back then. It shouldn't have given Eleanor the right to freeze it. But Eleanor wasn't just a mother. She was a predator who knew how to work the system. A new message appeared on the screen, a direct notification from the bank's fraud department. Report of elder abuse and financial exploitation filed. All associated accounts frozen pending police investigation. The phone slipped from Sarah's hand, clattering onto the dusty attic floor. Not only was her money gone, but the very act of trying to move it had triggered a trap. By attempting to use her Freedom Fund, she had provided the evidence Eleanor needed to prove Sarah was stealing from her. The smart move hadn't just failed, it had handed Eleanor the handcuffs. Did you find what you were looking for, dear? Eleanor's voice drifted up through the floorboards, honeyed and horrific. It's so sad when children try to rob the parents who gave them everything. The bank was very concerned when I told them about your episodes. Sarah looked at the phone. The screen was still glowing, showing the red banner of her own ruin. She was penniless, trapped, and now, in the eyes of the law, a thief. Sarah lunged for the phone, but Miller's heavy boot came down on it, crushing the glass into 1,000 shimmering shards. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed her by the hair and dragged her toward the attic door. "No!" Sarah screamed, twisting in his grip. She managed to plant a foot against the doorframe, shoving back with everything she had. Miller stumbled, and Sarah used the momentum to tear the diary from his reach and bolt down the narrow stairs. She hit the second-floor landing and didn't stop, her feet flying over the carpet. She reached the kitchen, the heart of the house, where the smell of bleach was strongest. She headed for the back door, but Eleanor was already there. The older woman wasn't gasping for air anymore. She stood tall, her silver hair perfectly in place, her eyes bright with a predatory glee. In her hand, she held a long, serrated bread knife. "Give me the book, Sarah," Eleanor said. Her voice was calm, the royal plural gone, replaced by a sharp, cold edge. "We've had a good run, haven't we? 30 years? Most people don't get that much time with a lie." "You killed her," Sarah said, holding the diary behind her back. "You followed Mary Johnson, and you ran her off the road. You stole me from a dead woman." "I saved you," Eleanor shrieked, the mask finally slipping. "You were sitting in the grass, covered in glass and blood, crying for a woman who was already gone. I gave you a name. I gave you a life. I gave you purpose." "You gave me a debt," Sarah shouted back. "You made me pay for my own kidnapping." Eleanor lunged. She was surprisingly fast for a woman who claimed to be dying of organ failure. The serrated blade flashed in the dim kitchen light. Sarah spun away, but she felt a sharp, stinging heat across her upper arm. She looked down and saw a line of crimson blooming through her sleeve. "You're staying here, Sarah," Eleanor hissed, backing her against the refrigerator. The machine hummed a grinding, metallic scream. "I've already filed the paperwork. The court will appoint me as your legal guardian. You'll spend the rest of your life in this house or in a ward where I hold the keys. That is the final payment." Sarah looked at the knife, then at the woman she had called mother. The fear that had ruled her for 30 years suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She realized Eleanor was terrified. The knife, the guard, the legal traps. They were the actions of a woman who knew her world was built on sand. "You have nothing, Eleanor," Sarah said. "I have everything." Eleanor swung the knife again. This time, Sarah didn't run. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it in a short, brutal arc. The metal connected with Eleanor's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the floor. Eleanor fell back, clutching her arm, her face twisting in pain. "Miller! Miller, help me!" Sarah didn't wait for the giant to arrive. She grabbed the knife and threw it under the refrigerator, then bolted for the bathroom near the laundry room. She slammed the door and locked it, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Subverted beat 3.6. Sarah leaned against the cool subway tile of the bathroom wall, her breath coming in jagged hitches. Her arm throbbed where the knife had grazed her, but she couldn't focus on the pain. She had the diary. She had the truth. Outside, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. A rising tide of blue and red light beginning to pulse against the frosted bathroom window. The police, Sarah thought. Thank God. She straightened her clothes and wiped the blood from her arm with a damp towel. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked haggard, but determined. She would walk out there, present the diary of Mary Johnson, show them the death certificate, and explain the mismatching blood tests. The truth was too big to ignore. The sirens died down to a low, idling hum in the driveway. Car doors slammed. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel. Sarah felt a surge of confidence. She was the victim here. She was the one who had been kidnapped and held in a psychological cage for 3 decades. The law was designed for this. It was designed to protect the innocent. She heard Eleanor's voice outside. Not the screaming of a villain, but a weak, fluttering sob. "In here. Please, officers, she's in the bathroom. She's armed." Sarah frowned. She checked the door. It was locked. She would wait for the officers to announce themselves. Then she would come out with her hands up, holding the evidence. "Sarah Miller? This is Officer Davis with the Columbus PD. Open the door and come out with your hands visible." Sarah took a deep breath. "Officer, I'm coming out. But I have evidence you need to see. I'm not the one who—" She unlocked the door and stepped out. Two officers stood in the hallway, their faces grim, their hands hovering near their holsters. Behind them, Eleanor was slumped in a chair, her arm wrapped in a bloody towel, looking like a frail bird broken by a storm. Miller stood over her, his face a mask of professional concern. "Drop the book, Sarah," Officer Davis said. "This isn't a weapon, it's a diary," Sarah said, holding it out. "It proves Eleanor kidnapped me. It proves—" "We've seen your files, Sarah," Davis interrupted, his voice pitying. He held up a thick folder, the one Eleanor had been working on for years. "We have the psychiatric reports, the history of daily debt delusions, the documented episodes of violent paranoia." Sarah froze. "Those aren't delusions. She made me write those. And we have the lab report you stole from the hospital," Davis continued. He held up a piece of paper. Sarah recognized it, the mismatch results. "The hospital administrator called us. She said you've been harassing the staff, trying to forge records to prove you weren't related to your mother so you could avoid the donor surgery." The world tilted. Sarah looked at Eleanor. The older woman didn't look away. She gave Sarah a tiny, triumphant smile that didn't reach her watery eyes. "She's sick, officer," Eleanor whimpered. "She thinks I'm a stranger. She thinks I killed her real mother. She's been living in this fantasy for weeks. I was so afraid she'd hurt herself. Or me." Sarah looked at the officers. They weren't looking for a kidnapper. They were looking at a delusional daughter who had just attacked her dying mother with a skillet. The diary in her hand didn't look like evidence. It looked like the scrapbook of a madwoman. By trying to use the truth, Sarah had walked directly into the role Eleanor had scripted for her 20 years ago. She wasn't being rescued. She was being committed. The lead officer, Michael Davis, stepped forward. He looked tired, his suit wrinkled, his eyes avoiding Sarah's direct gaze. He reached for his handcuffs. "Let's go, Sarah. We'll get you some help." "Wait," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, desperate whisper. "Just look at the billing codes." Davis paused, his hand halfway to her wrist. "What?" "The hospital records," Sarah said, the words tumbling out. "Eleanor said she has kidney failure. Check the billing codes on the lab results she gave you. Code 585.6 is for end-stage renal disease. But look at the secondary insurance filing. She's been billing for vitamin D injections and saline under a different name. My name. She's using my identity to fund her own fake medical history." Davis frowned. He looked at the paper in his hand. He was a man who spent his Sundays rewriting his dead wife's grocery list. He knew the weight of a paper trail. "I work in corporate finance," Sarah said, stepping toward him, ignoring the other officer's warning hand. "I know how a ledger works. Eleanor didn't just kidnap me. She's been running an insurance fraud scheme for a decade, using my social security number to bankroll this house. That daily debt notebook? It's not a delusion. It's a record of every cent she laundered through my accounts." Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the notebook. She flipped to the last page. "Look at the entry from 3 days ago. Lab fees, $1,200. Now look at the hospital's actual bill. They didn't charge her. They couldn't, because the technician she bribed didn't enter it into the system. She paid him in cash. Cash she took from my Freedom Fund." Davis took the notebook. He flipped through the pages, his eyes widening as he saw the meticulous, shaking handwriting. It wasn't the work of a madwoman. It was the work of a bookkeeper who had been recording her own ransom. He looked at Eleanor. The frail woman had gone very still. The watery eyes were suddenly sharp and dry. "Check the basement," Sarah said. "The laundry chute. I saw her throwing away files when the sirens started. The real records. The ones that show who I actually am." Davis nodded to his partner. "Check the chute." The next 10 minutes were a blur of motion. The second officer returned from the basement clutching a stack of scorched papers, the remains of the Johnson file that Eleanor hadn't quite managed to burn. "She's a match," the officer said, holding up a charred fragment of a birth certificate. "The name on the original filing is Johnson, not Miller." Davis turned back to Eleanor. The pity was gone from his eyes. "Eleanor Miller, you're under arrest for kidnapping, identity theft, and insurance fraud." Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood up, her face a mask of cold, aristocratic fury. "I gave her everything," she hissed as Davis clicked the cuffs around her wrists. "And this is how she balances the books." Sarah watched as they led Eleanor out of the Victorian house. She watched as the home health aide, Miller, was tackled in the backyard as he tried to jump the fence. The house, once a tomb, felt suddenly, hollowly empty. 6 months later, the sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a small, modern apartment in downtown Columbus. There was no lavender scent here, no bleach, just the smell of fresh paint and the faint, sweet aroma of a new life. Sarah Johnson sat at her glass-topped desk, looking out at the horizon. Her arm had healed, leaving only a thin, silver scar that she didn't bother to hide. She had spent the last half-year in a whirlwind of legal depositions and identity restoration. But today, for the first time, there were no forms to sign, no debts to calculate. She opened a small drawer and pulled out a new notebook. It was empty, the pages white and clean. She took a pen, a good one, her own, and wrote a single line on the first page. "May 14th, 1 cup of coffee, 1 sunrise, balance, 0. She smiled. It was a wide, soft smile, the kind that reached her eyes. She reached down and adjusted her socks, 1 red, 1 blue. They were her lucky pair. Outside, the city hummed with a life that finally belonged to her. She wasn't a liability. She wasn't a mistake. She was Sarah Johnson. And for the first time in 30 years, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She stood up, walked to the window, and opened it wide. The air was cool and smelled of rain and possibility. She didn't look back at the shadows. She only looked forward, toward the light. The end.